Hello, and welcome to this webinar about the 19th board meeting of the Green Climate Fund. My name is Grant, and it's my pleasure to guide you through this webinar. We really appreciate that you've joined us today. We have an exciting schedule ahead. Firstly, my colleague Ben will give a presentation on some of the key issues discussed at the 19th board meeting, which he recently attended. We'll have 10 minutes for questions after that. Then my colleague Svetlana will give a presentation about our study on gender mainstreaming in the GCF and an update on the negotiations that took place at the board around the new gender policy. This will be followed by some questions and discussions. Finally, before we close, as a bonus, I'll make a short presentation covering some key indicators from the projects so far approved by the board, so please stick around to the end for that. To ask questions or make comments, please use the chat function. To make questions really clear, you can tag them as questions by using the 3 little dots as shown here. This will help us a little, but don't worry too much about it. We'll read all the comments. So, let's get going.
In addition to me, our presenters today are Svetlana Frenova, a senior consultant and gender specialist in our team, and Ben Bartle, also a senior consultant at ECO. Ben will now speak about the 19th GCF board meeting and some key issues that emerged from that. Ben has been a valued member of our team since 2014. He is a project formulation specialist who has worked on designing a wide variety of market creation and transformation projects in the mitigation and adaptation sectors. He has, amongst other qualifications, a Master of Science in Environmental Management and Economics from the University of Auckland, New Zealand. Ben participates in most of the GCF board meetings and will be very happy to meet with you there if you attend. Over to Ben.
Thank you for the introduction, Grant, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining today. My presentation will be on the 19th meeting of the board in Songdo, Korea, which I just recently attended. Generally seen as a successful board meeting with a record number of project approvals. Some key policies were also passed, and there have been a number of updates and issues which I'll cover through the next few slides. So I will begin the presentation with a short overview of the key policies that were approved and not approved at the board. Those being the Indigenous Peoples Policy, the Environment and Social Policy, and the Gender Policy, which actually became quite a thorny issue. Then I will explore the policies and matters related to the approval of funding proposals, such as concessionality and incremental cost, and indicative minimum benchmarks that were also up at the board, some discussion papers. Then we'll explore the approval of funding proposals and some of the key important outcomes of those and what that means for future project proposals, things to take into consideration if you're an accredited entity or an NDA. And then I will provide a short update on accreditation, followed by a number of other issues that came up at the board, and conclude there. So firstly, some of the key policies that were actually up at this board for approval was the Indigenous Peoples Policy, which was actually approved within 5 minutes, of course, to a room full of applause, as this has been a sensitive subject on the cards for some time, quite far back in terms of board meetings. The second to be approved was the Environmental Social Policy, which finally got there on the last day after a few tweaks based on feedback from some board members. And unfortunately, the Gender Policy has been deferred, and Svetlana will talk a little bit about this later. But let's say this was quite a thorny issue between some of the board members. The language used in the gender paper and the policy has already been significantly weakened, and it was not really, in my opinion, a good move that they wanted to weaken. Some board members wanted to weaken the gender policy even further, but Svetlana will talk a bit on that soon. There were also a number of papers and matters related to the approval of funding proposals. So first off, there was a presentation of a review of the structure and effectiveness of the ITAP. The general consensus between board members was that the ITAP is doing a great job of screening projects. However, many board members raised concerns over the ITAP's inadequate staffing, saying that in order to scale up the number of projects presented per board, the ITAP would need to scale up its number of technical staff as well. There were also two papers regarding the issue of concessionality and incremental cost, an issue that has been long coming to the Secretariat to present to the board. The Secretariat argued that there is a need for full cost policy in order to bring clarity to some of the issues raised by ITAP and the board in previous board meetings in terms of the review and presentation of projects, their level of concessionality, and the fundamental idea of incremental cost reasoning. The Secretariat also said that they need a new technical approach, including methodologies and tools, which will rely on best practices, and highlighted also the need for extensive consultation with AEs, with accredited entities, to decide on the best way of developing these tools. And a number of methodologies and tools were presented, and some were recommended in the papers. However, some board members argued that concessionality cost calculation should be differentiated between SIDS and LDCs and the rest of and other countries, while others argued that they shouldn't differentiate between the two, and doing that is too complicated. And despite a comprehensive paper from the Secretariat which set out a range of options and how different tools could be applied, such as incremental cost and grant element calculations, the board still struggled to reach consensus, again around this thorny issue of concessionality. These two papers reignited old themes and debate which we've seen in the past, and many argued, is the GCF just another MDB that's focused on making a return by using such calculations, or is it a genuine fund to serve the needs of developing countries? Likewise, a paper on indicative minimum benchmarks was presented by the GCF Investment Committee. The paper and the idea of these benchmarks were intended to provide a tool to help the GCF Secretariat and Board in their judgment of projects. It was recommended that the name minimum should be changed to indicative rather than setting minimums. It should be indications. And the Investment Committee agreed to establish these benchmarks by B20, and they will decide soon on a pilot period for the implementation of this tool. So do keep an eye on the GCF website for these three matters. In regards to funding proposals, 23 projects were up for approval. This represented a GCF commitment of around $1 billion US. This was broadly split between loans and grants, as you can see in these graphs. However, 3 of the projects had guarantee mechanisms in them, built into them, which was very much welcomed by the board. One proposal was the first approved under the simplified approval process, and also geographically, Africa still remains underrepresented in terms of the total amount requested. A few proposals actually went through to a second round, but in the end all got through, and this now takes the portfolio to around 76 approved projects with a total of $3.73 billion US. In regards to the general process or evolution of funding proposal review, some of the continuing issues arose, focused on the absence of policy gaps, in particular the absence of incremental cost reasoning methodology and that to calculate concessionality. Also, a number of issues are raised in regards to the thematic guidelines that are necessary, in particular in water and agricultural areas, in order to inform project developers on process to follow. A number of projects were challenged on their level of concessionality, as we have seen in past board meetings. There is clearly now an issue that the volume of projects coming to board, 23 at this board, is growing and will continue to grow. This is around 3,000 pages of pre-reading for board members, and many challenge the idea that is this current project approval process really fit for purpose, and many board members were calling for a two-stage approval process and intersessional decision making. There were a number of notable comments on specific funding proposals. In regards to FP70, the CSO was concerned that the full market price would create distortions, that there should be support or subsidies for the rural poor. Another concern was that the private sector would then monopolise the stove market with the financial mechanism that was proposed. And there's also some concern from one of the board members regarding the high share of concessionality from the GCF. In terms of FP71, another controversial project from the World Bank, the industry sector players were said to have lobbied hard against this project, which reflected later comments from board members stating that the prevailing regulatory environment and a lack of regulatory support was failing to address these factors in the market, and that the project itself would contribute actually to market distortions which actually deter private sector investment. The private sector observer commented that their understanding itself on the project was not a lack of financing that deterred energy efficiency investments, but rather a lack of demand and electricity subsidies. Whilst there was a technical assistance component and finance, the regulatory environment was simply not in place. FP77, a number of questions were raised by board members in regards to the high cost of CO2 emissions reductions per tonne. Also the necessity of solar on the rooftops of this urban renewal project. FP73 was approved with conditions. I'm unaware of these conditions, and you may find them on the GCF website on the term sheet for this project. It's important to note that FP73 was the first project that made use of a project preparation facility grant. There was 1.5 million US in preparation of this project. FP78 also approved it with conditions. There was a concern voiced that there was no concrete investment pipeline, and the 25 million from private sector was without a letter of support. So that's it for funding proposals. Now there were also some updates on readiness and accreditation. The revised readiness and preparatory work program is also available online on the GCF website, and I recommend you checking that out if that's of interest to you. Also, the accreditation panel had been suspended since the last meeting, so no entities were up for accreditation. Since 6 new members of that panel have now been appointed, hopefully they can restart soon. Also, direct access entities have been prioritised again until B20. The accreditation team also suggested a pilot program for project-based accreditation to gain additional direct access entities. One board member also questioned whether direct access entities that are national entities should be able to submit regional projects to the GCF. Other thorny issues raised at the board were adjustments to the fee policy, the project management fee policy for accredited entities, which have now been adjusted downwards for most types of projects except for micro, and this was finally agreed on the last day. 2 additional board agenda items were deferred for 2 weeks because they were released too late and it was considered there was not time to provide any input from the board members. These were an analysis of potential additional investment priority areas, and the second was related to project and program eligibility and selection criteria. In conclusion, some possible implications for project developers. There is again a continued focus on direct access entities and support to them. Concerns. There's still some concerns over the high levels of concessionality in some projects and slow board approval on important policy issues such as gender, and a need to progress on project metrics such as concessionality and incremental cost reasoning. Things to keep an eye on are those options for further guidance on concessionality and the indicative minimum benchmarks that are proposed by the investment committee. Also, the development and application of the incremental cost calculation methodology and alternative methodologies, which are currently going to be developed, which will all have important impacts on project developers moving forward. Thank you very much and look forward to questions.